All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this screencast on Module 58, the Trait Perspective. So I'm going to jump right in. We're primarily going to focus on factor analysis in this screencast. But first, a brief little history lesson of some of the major names that have influenced the trait perspective. And one of the major challenges in the trait perspective is trying to whittle down the number of traits that are essential to describing personality. Right? So I'm taking for granted you know what a trait is. So the father of the trait perspective is a gentleman named Gordon Allport. And Allport, believe it or not, did not do a good job of whittling down his list. He had 4,500 traits that basically that were personality traits that comprised our personality. So imagine taking that test. Raymond Cattell used what's called factor analysis, which we're going to study today, which is going to be the bulk of this screencast, to whittle down the 4,500 to 16. Hans Eysenck actually had in your book 2 dimensions of personality. So kind of the spectrum, right? And that's more of a modern day way of looking at personality, that certain traits appear on a spectrum where we could have extroversion and then on one part of the spectrum and then on the other part of the pole would be introversion. And then the most widely used contemporary theory is the 5-factor or the Big 5 inventory, Costa and McCrae. So basically they also use factor analysis, and it's an empirically derived test. So we're really going to talk about factor analysis and how did we get down from 4,500 to 16 or to 5, and how exactly do we understand what these personality traits are using factor analysis. So the first question is, what is factor analysis? So let's start here. So it's a statistical process. You will not need to know how to do it. You just need to know the information it provides. So all you need to know is the information it provides when we engage and do factor analysis. Now, one of the guiding questions in factor analysis is the idea that certain traits seem to be related. So that's one of the very, very important questions, is that some traits seem to be related, and factor analysis is going to identify relationships between traits. Okay? So one of the goals in factor analysis is to identify relationships between traits. Okay, so let's get more formal here. So here's a formal definition of factor analysis. So the first part that's really important is it finds relationships among diverse items, and then it allows us to group them together, right? So it's finding relationships among diverse items and variables, and it allows us to group those together. And then by doing further analysis, we can start to see that some variables correlate really highly with one another. And the assumption then is that there's a single factor influencing all of them. We're going to call that single factor a super factor. And what I want you to think of as some of the super factors, I want you to think of some of the big 5, the 5 factors. I want you to think of like extroversion and introversion as a super factor. Okay? I know Myers didn't use that word, but think of them as super factors. Think of openness as a super factor. What that is trying to say is that there are a number of traits that comprise or make up extroversion. So extroversion is a super factor. It's called SF. And let's say it's made up of a whole bunch of, we'll call them like these just little factors, just F, that correlate really highly with each other. And if we actually study people's answers on tests, on personality tests that are meant to assess this, we can start seeing that extroverted people answer certain questions the same way that try to analyze specific behaviors, smaller behaviors, and we'll call those again these little factors, and extroversion is the super factor. Let's look at openness as one example of how to do this. So openness is a super factor on the BFI, right? But it's made up of a whole bunch of other traits that are clustered together, right? Because what is openness by itself? So all those traits that cluster together make up openness. So let's take a look at some of them. Oh, I spelt that wrong. What is going on with my spelling? That is really funny spelling. Intellectual curiosity is one of them. Maybe I am not intellectually curious enough to do spell check. So that is one of the factors, right? Creativity, preference for novelty, preference for variety, really values the use of the imagination and is very imaginative, and very independent, and likes varied activities rather than strict routines, right? So basically these novelty and degree of intellectual curiosity, and I spelled it wrong again. What is wrong with me, right? These all comprise the super factor called openness. So basically the test is going to give questions that are going to try to see how intellectually curiosity people are, how creative they are. And what we find is that people who score high on openness tend to really value and score high either in these questions or to exhibit behaviors that are highly creative, highly imaginative, right? So these are all the little factors that make up the super factor called openness. Another example would be people who score high in extroversion. This would be our super factor. And by doing factor analysis, which is an analysis of test questions on, say, a personality inventory, we start noticing that certain people in questions about how sociable are you score really high. They desire a high level of sociability. They also tend to be a little bit more assertive in situations. They tend to be much more active. They tend to seek excitement, and they tend to be very impulsive. Well, all of these are the little factors. And what happens is we take into consideration all of these scores on all of these little factors, and these all seem to correlate with each other, meaning people who are extroverted, the super factor, tend to score high in sociability and assertiveness and level of activity and level of excitement seeking and level of impulsivity. They all tend to score high. So all these little factors make up this super factor. Okay? Now, imagine if we replace this with introversion. They would probably score a lot lower, but it would be the same little factors that make up the super factors, right? To help us get to those super factors. So that's what factor analysis does. So here are 4 different ways of looking at factor analysis. I really like the red one and the blue one. Hopefully I didn't make any more spelling errors on that. So you can pause me and you can copy those down. I hope you have a better understanding of what factor analysis gives us. But remember, you don't have to know how to do it. Okay, and I'll go try to figure out how to learn to spell the word curiosity.